Let's set the stage a moment. As I mentioned in my previous response and rebuttals to some bad faith critiques of Steven Universe, I am not a longtime Steven Universe fan. I never engaged with the fan theories, the speculation, the community discourse. I never had to wait for Steven bombs. I didn't needlessly obsess over Rebecca Sugar and all of the other people who worked on the show, although at this point I've become somewhat familiar. Point is, I watched, get this, a television show. I binged the whole thing from episode 1 to the end of Future in roughly 2 weeks on my first watch, and I've rewatched it a couple times since. I knew so little about the show that not a single spoiler made it into my radar other than the vague sentiment that some people didn't like the ending. And I didn't even know if they meant the ending of Future or the end of the original series. I didn't even know Future was a 20-episode epilogue until halfway through season 3. I thought it was a second movie or something. This is to say, I believe I have engaged with this material in its most natural form, as a completed story not clouded by spite and wait times and personal growth and political judgments, and what I thought first when I finished this show was, really? This is the show that has criticism videos with views in the millions? Videos where people can't help but poorly construct Gish-Gallop fallacy arguments, not even attempting to be factually accurate in their criticisms, where they openly pepper in constantly referring to how fat and ugly the characters are and constantly demeaning Rebecca as a queer and Jewish person. Seriously. I think it's time we take another critical look at Steven Universe, this time a good faith one, not mirrored in the sludge of 2016. But first, you've just clicked on a new Steven Universe video by hiding in private, when suddenly, bam! Raid Shadow Legends. The free game that has been sweeping the internet and sweeping people's phones, Raid is a game with a meticulously detailed art style and tons of unique champions. You'll need all the strength you can muster to fight one of its toughest bosses, Hydra. Each head of this multi-necked mythical snake comes with different gameplay adjustments to account for, one of which being the Head of Decay, whose passive skill temporarily decreases your champion's max HP each time you heal your own party. It will also occasionally charge for a self-heal, and if you don't break the shield in time, it comes back like new. One of the most creative and terrifying heads is that of the Head of Suffering, which can target your champions with a pain link effect. This effect distributes the damage that the head takes with you when you attack it. If you don't have champions to handle this link and debuff them, then you're gonna end up hurting yourself a lot just to take it down. This October, be in for a scare with Raid in the Raid Yard. From October 15th to November 10th, you can download Raid Shadow Legends with the links below. Copy your player ID and venture over to raidyard.plarium.com. Once you start digging in this haunted graveyard, you have the chance to dig up real-life prizes, ranging from epic and legendary tier Halloween-themed raid champions to Amazon gift cards amounting to a total value of $20,000. And everybody likes free stuff, right? Simply log in on 7 different days between now and October 23rd and get a free legendary champion, Sun Wukong. Raid's take on the Monkey King from Chinese mythology. It's the perfect time to get started now. Use my link in the description below, or scan my QR code on the screen to get insane bonuses, including the epic tier champion Drake from the Lizardmen faction, and useful refills such as Spirit Times and XP boosters. So thanks again to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video and making this channel a viability. Where did we leave off? Oh yeah. As a brief description, Steven Universe is a show that started in 2013 that ended in 2019, so let's lay the groundwork for some base context. Steven Universe is a boy living with his adoptive family, the Crystal Gems. The reason, we find out, is that the Crystal Gem Rose Quartz had a child with the human Greg Universe. Rose Quartz gave up her life to give life to her son Steven, who is now half human and half gem. Opening credits play. The appearance of all these gems and their tendency to go after Steven makes it much safer to leave Steven with his mom's friends, who actively make preserving these gems and protecting the Earth their personal duty, in hopes that they will one day find a way to cure the gems who've been corrupted, because, understandably, these gems used to be like them. A few of these details are initially obscured from the viewer, as the first season is mostly an episodic show with sprinkled in bits of lore that you're supposed to piece together, with Stephen, who starts off with no real control or understanding of his powers, and just on the cusp of the age where the crystal gems are considering filling him in on their past. You see the world through Stephen's eyes, and you understand what he does. He starts as this fun-loving child, but though growing in competence, power, and awareness, he never loses this unfaltering optimism, instead growing in his ability to apply that optimism to the world in people who other characters normally, somewhat reasonably, have lost faith in. I think that's why it's so confusing that so much of the vitriol has been aimed at the show. A show full of all types of flawed characters built on the idea that you can always make a change, and tackling subjects of identity, prejudice, and the complicated nature of relationships. A show so fundamentally filled with the idea that we should first give others the benefit of the doubt, extend out our arms, and give other people a chance, not judge people for how they look, or even dismiss them if they initially do things that we don't seem to understand or agree with. A show maturely focused on empathy and understanding. Like, surely there are better shows to throw vitriol at than what is, at its worst, a mishandled but well-meaning show about being open to others, and at its best, well, we will get to that eventually. Steven Universe attempts to cover these topics through the guise of their most pure elements. Rather than strictly making them an allegory from the ground up, it's kind of like Beastars, if any of you have seen that. Someone can say Beastars tackles racism, covers topics surrounding racial oppression and struggle, but nobody can claim it as a direct allegory for racism. To do so is to take allegorical elements of Beastars' world and turn them into contradictory racial stereotypes. Because a society of animals where the main social conflict is herbivores and carnivores has no direct corollary to human society. Certain races aren't born stronger, certain sexes aren't universally fragile. Beastars can be used to mine meaning for our own world. It can tell us pieces of ourselves through contexts unlike our own, but it does not comment fully or directly on human society. And trying to see it as a one-for-one allegory will always lead to crazy conclusions. This is intentional. This is how you place multiple layered meanings within stories. Suddenly, when people start taking it too literally, one can interpret messages more generally about racial, sexual, and class struggles, and flip the meanings with the parts that don't align with our actual world, creating moral messages that are obviously not intended, nor even reflect good faith interpretation of what the show or art is obviously intending to give. This is pretty basic media literacy, like day one stuff. Allegory is not going to be a perfect one-for-one of our world. That's the whole point. Metaphor is not meant to be a 100% accurate thing, and every detail is not supposed to mimic our world accurately. The point of fantasy, of story, is to place things within new contexts outside of ourselves in order to gain a better understanding about ourselves. But I think it's also the cause of a lot of moral issues that people have stated with aspects of Steven Universe's world building. From fusion to gem forms to abilities and the willingness to change. And all along, the story is never asking you to literally interpret all these things, because they are intentionally concepts that have been abstracted from how we categorize them in our own society. Instead, aiming to show their purest traits and rebuild them physically from the ground up on that starting point. Different colored gems are not different races of gems. Gems do not have secondary sex characteristics or gender like we conceive of it. They do not work as stand-ins for specific human genders or sexes. These aspects, including sexuality, have been intentionally abstracted and muddied in order to take an abstracted form of a person, separate from the human descriptors that are more so than anything secondary to the actual conflicts, then show that conflict and sense of self through a form that is even stated to not be literal. That way we may recognize aesthetic qualities that are indicative of real people, but not directly an allegory for them. It makes it freeing of the baggage associated with the lines that separate human societies and the way that oppression has manifested across all cultures in human history. It allows us to gleam into a fanciful future where we can be anyone we want, look how we feel, and express the aspects of love that fit with our perception of ourselves. something so painfully limited with modern technology and history, a psychological aspect of humans that are always limited by our still unchosen forms. Fusion is not romance, but it can be. Fusion is the purest abstraction, the embodiment of two people's relationship, or the embodiment of a friend group dynamic, or of a family, or of a group. Father and son, partner to partner, friend to friend. It's a visualization of the abstractly understood bond held between the two forms and combination of colors. To interpret the gems as a literal allegory defeats the entire purpose of their characterization and the messages that you can gain from the intentionally fanciful elements of the show. It also will necessarily lead you to feel that they act unlike themselves when you conceptualize them as if they are humans, rather than the ideas given form, ego, and memory. Given the freedom that gems have, though, they still can't permanently change some parts of themselves, also serving for relatable allegory. They may be able to get big and small and temporarily change form. They may be able to reform after shattering into different ways than what they are. Their form or their model may not be consistent, but it still centers a general idea. It's still linked to the literal cut of their gem. Some gems are sturdier, bigger, clearer, and of course, gems are different from one another. There is a limit though, and that comes into the broader theme of how gems connect to human psychology. Personality of every human is determined by the frontal lobe of the brain. Severe damage to that lobe can cause our personalities to completely change, but just because we have a certain personality doesn't stop us from growing and making a change if we actively dedicate ourselves to trying. It's the same for gems, which all follow similar personality types as we see with the countless ruby gems and amethysts. They are all their own people, but they are also fundamentally the same core personality with changes to make of their own. The colors of the personalities fuse and create combinations of those personality traits, but it goes deeper than that too. Each gem, in theory, serves under a diamond, the most powerful of each of the personality spectrums. The pieces represent broader aspects of the cognition ruling personality types. Yellow is logic, blue is emotion, and pink is this sort of free sense of empathy, openness, and chance. The want to find new things, the want to change. White mentions in Season 5 how all gems have flaws, at least as she sees them, and the crazy thing is her ability to immediately recognize the flaws of characters she otherwise hasn't met. She is white, every color of light all at once, so she knows intimately each piece and personality of light equally, because the way that the gems obtain color is not through pigment and hue, but the way that light reflects through their being. Pearl is obsessive, Garnet is dependent. These aren't flaws in and of themselves, it's how she phrases these traits. But as a viewer, we have seen these aspects in both positive and negative, just as pieces of who they are. When Sapphire and Ruby are apart, they can't imagine not having more fun with each other around. It takes the idea of light and color and explains their tendency toward leaning on each other. White says explicitly within the show, yellow absorbs all of the blue in the light that gives her color, so she's weak to blue. Blue absorbs all the warm aspects of her spectrum, making her weak too, and relying on pink to feel whole. Logic operates without empathy, but emotion can cause logic to falter in cruelty. Emotion lacks directive to stabilize without something to inspire it to act towards. Pink gives that direction, and more so, something stated is white spends all day in her own head, which is once again literal and allegorical. Pink, yellow, and blue, together as colors, make white. They are all three aspects of a full human psyche: the logic, the emotion, and the ego, or the free will, however you want to phrase pink, the ability to change. White naturally contains all light, and so she seeks perfection, which in her own idea is equal proportion. After all, acting outside of a perfect combination would prevent her from being white, making her imperfect in her own eyes. Off color, as she states, and eventually becomes. It is fitting then, a moment of embarrassment for her, a non-active decision that breaks her from her stillness, from her being stuck in her own head, is the addition of more pink. It's that chance and change that pink offers back to her. White's own free will, the thing that she had suppressed as a perceived weakness. A brief moment where she does become off-color. These are the rules that the world of Steven Universe operates by. But then, on top of that, there are also plenty of moments of visual imagery and messaging that this core structure is able to explore. Having this supposed perfect combination, one being of all of the drawn hues and one of the light spectrums, black and white, with white being still, singularity, and this chaotic, unconventional embracement being black, the embracement of individuality being the full color spectrum. All of this use of the full spectrum of color has codes to the message of positive LGBT visual aesthetics as well, literally living in a world of black and white versus living in a world of color. It is also notable that while white is a singular being containing all the spectrum and forms of white, the combination of all of the colors of the crystal gems that Steven forms is black instead, with obsidian. All light may form white, but all drawn colors create black. This also invokes the classic imagery of white versus black, a deeply encoded Jungian part of most of human art across nearly every culture for millennia. The representation of order versus chaos, law versus freedom, which in this story are exactly what they are emblematic of thematically. This is also harkening back to the Romantic period. In the 19th century, women's literature in the Romantic period, alongside our lesbian vampires, was the rehabilitation of Satan as a poetic character. First seen as the black, the chaos, against God's order, the perfect, unfeeling white light. Now seen as a rebellion and freedom against God's unjust and cruel laws. Since this period in literature also came as the century immediately following the French Revolution and anti-authority sentiment was at one of the many high points in Europe, and don't worry, I'm not going down a complete rabbit hole on some random video essay tripe. This stuff is actually seeped in modern culture and our conception of the relationship between these two concepts. The examples are endless, but a popular recent one that I liked, of course, as a Persona fan, is when Joker summons Satanael to defeat Yaldabaoth. Yaldabaoth being the Gnostic conception of the false god of Christianity, and being adorned in white, with Satanael, or Satan, the good guy, being cloaked in black. As Persona 5 is a game about thinking and acting for yourself and fighting against a hive mind, this chaotic Satanael of individuality taking down the god of control, or conformance, perfectly plays into these tropes in a very obvious sense. Another huge example is the best-selling series of all time, One Piece. The world government, and by extension the Marines, are, on the whole, always represented as the brighter, desaturated colors, and primarily use white in their designs, while the Straw Hats and most of the pirates are generally more colorful and dark in their palettes. This isn't a hard rule, of course, but it's about subtly using color to indicate this fight, with the pirates representing chaos and the world government presiding over control and order. One of the famous lines from One Piece, of course, being that the Marines are the only things that stand between order and chaos. This, I hope, is at least enough to get you to think about where you can spot pieces of this in many of the series you enjoy as well. I hope you realize, if you hadn't before, these are fundamental concepts to human conflict. They literally invade all forms of art, universally, for hundreds, if not over 1,000 years. And thematically and visually, they almost always play into their classical roots. So much thought went through this consistency as well, with white wanting to control others, and black, obsidian, being the one who brings liberation. And yet, all of this goes unmentioned when instead people throw fits over Peridot's hair changing size between episodes. Give me a break. You're embarrassing yourself. You're looking at an ocean and complaining the puddle next to it is too shallow. The ending is also emblematic and foreshadowed with Peridot, Lapis, and Steven, when Lapis first moved into the barn. Lapis is uncooperative and not willing to listen to Peridot, but Peridot is insistent on making things right with Lapis. Lapis acts emotionally and won't consider Peridot's efforts, and Peridot acts purely in their own idea of logic, not understanding Lapis's emotions and social cues, at least until the end. However, Lapis switches from cold to Peridot to welcoming and warm with Steven immediately, mimicking the other diamonds. Peridot serving yellow, Lapis serving blue, Steven as pink. You can also see this between Sapphire being blue and Ruby being pink, in their relationship as Garnet. It all runs down to the smallest pieces of themselves, or how Steven was able to get through to Lapis in Season 1. Jasper is also one of the toxic aspects of what pink represents, but you see, even as Lapis recognizes the relationship as toxic in Season 2, she can't help but feel weak to her. At the same time, Jasper, being a mixture of pink and yellow, is obsessed and adores power, and this is her creative pink, thinking of the potential with her logical yellow. It's why she is also weak to Lapis, and desires to stay with her despite knowing that they're awful for each other. The spontaneity, the freedom, sometimes takes form in chaos and outrage, in the same way that it can be used for empathy. It's the freedom of change, which means it isn't always positive. We learn in Steven Universe Future that Pink Diamond used to be prone to angry emotional outbursts, having elements of both yellow and blue in small portion, but ruled by her own will and curiosity of the world. These emotional outbursts traumatized her old Pearl before White took repossession of them. The entire show operates on this internal consistency, as these elements of being human are innate to us all, and so will necessarily draw some allegory to anyone who watches the show. Just like we all have each of these aspects in different ratios, though, the characters do too. Their form, the aspects of their gems that determine the colors, create multiple tones of each gem too. Even if they hypothetically serve one gem under the Empire rules, Amethyst, for example, is purple, a combination of pink and blue, which explains her pleasure-seeking and emotionally insecure nature, often disregarding logic for fun, going with her gut, being spontaneous with what feels good. Pearl's base body is white, with pieces of blue, yellow, and pink, which explains her being stated as a rare type of Pearl, or how early episodes hint that she was not a regular Pearl, considering Blue's Pearl is strikingly blue and Yellow's is strikingly yellow, and Pink's Pearl repossessed by Diamond was also heavily pink. It makes one wonder why the new Pearl Pink was given contains so much of each, but I'll leave that to the fan theorists. I think there are some pretty easy assumptions to make about that. My point with all of this is just, any large critique of the series that does not even attempt to engage with these quite literally world-defining elements of the show have failed to understand the show by pure omission. When doing an analysis or a critique, not even giving these a passing mention signals to me that they slept through their basic English literature courses and are operating more on random tangents that they find important rather than attempting to engage with the work fairly. And I mean, once again, any English graduate, any person who took a literature course in college especially, will recognize this sort of stuff easily. And heck, most art classes that cover any type of character design and portraying thought through visuals will cover these aspects of color theory and the importance of sharp lines versus curved ones and how they portray different messages to the audience subtly. These elements, whether recognized actively or not, are core to characterization, the messages of the show, the themes, and the very choice of aesthetics. They are bold, precise, and experimental, pushing the ways that we conceptualize things about our own personhood. And to devalue this great concept, the obvious effort that is put in with petty and dull criticism over design preferences of not liking the backgrounds or Pearl's eyes looking kind of funny in some episodes, is so patently unserious that I hope you'll forgive me for glossing over these menial preference differences throughout the rest of this video and this upcoming series. Despite having my initial hesitations, color theory is, at least to some extent, a provable science. The way that we perceive and associate things based purely on color and context is hardwired into us. How much of that is biological and how much of that is socialized is hard to tell, but by a young age we have already subconsciously categorized things based on a constant and consistent association with them. Heck, say you didn't do art or literature. These are even things critical to many Marketing 101 courses that you would take in a business degree. I say this, of course, as a philosophy and psychology double major with a minor in marketing, who had many friends in the art department. I saw for myself and talked with many others about these concepts. They aren't some crazy left field thing. They're a casual part of our world, and any character designer and story writer, anyone professionally working in the field who came up actively learning, will have been taught what the colors mean. And any of those people with that background, when looking at Steven Universe, can see very obviously the amount of consistency and effort put into that, and how it portrays messages to the audience. They will be taught that aggressive characters should be more jagged and sharp, while gentler characters should be more round, that red is an energetic color and blue is a slower, more relaxed one. While these are taught as well, they are mostly universal and innately understood subconsciously as well. I mean, animals in nature know not to eat frogs or lizards that have certain bright colors because it signals to them from color alone that they are toxic to eat. Association with green being life and browns and blacks meaning death are hardwired in, as when vegetation is seen, living things are likely to exist there. Food is there, but say a burned down forest or a sandy desert, these portray, even from a far blurry distance based on color, what you could possibly find. It's partially socialized, yes, but also partially a hardwired product of evolutionary survival. These colors are so standard for use across most all other media. You can actually pretty easily understand how stories will unfold if you only piece together the colors that characters tend to wear in certain scenes. Multiple good videos and papers have been written on the distinct colors of the Breaking Bad cast, for example, which all consistently follow specific palettes. So, it's clearly laughable, embarrassingly so, to imply or worse off state that Rebecca had no idea what they were doing, or didn't think things through. That because the storyboard team also primarily did the writing for the show, that somehow that meant that they never worked out what would happen in the story. A tertiary understanding of art theory with any bachelor's in art would likely grasp enough to understand without thinking, would likely agree with that. That's why you don't see many dyed-in-the-wool artists crapping on Steven Universe, but often softly or quietly supporting it. Well, either that or, such as myself, staying away from the series entirely. People who actively work in animation, have histories in the industry when speaking on it normally, offer nearly nothing but praise. And I hope that you can grasp at least a tip of why that is. That even on the most subconscious levels, Steven Universe clearly lays out its characterization and thematic points for one to see. And that's especially important when dealing with children's media. So, part 2. A kids show. I find it really irritating when someone says, "It's just a kids show," in order to write off valid critiques or low writing quality. So that's not what I'm going to be doing here. I believe children's art should be held to the same standards of artistic integrity, if not higher than art made for adults. The thing is, though, underneath the rubble of a bad objection here is a statement, it's a kid's show. Throw out the just. There's no reason to baby it or treat it as lesser, but there is worth in acknowledging it. The reason for this is because a kids show is tasked with a much different standard of writing in order to get specific concepts across to an audience less equipped with information about the greater world. The way that we inherently grasp onto concepts is the way that we can visualize them, often based on our knowledge of the real world and our experiences. So in the case of children, this is primarily their experiences, as children, that they can take these lessons away into. I've seen a lot of people characterize the portrayal of Bismuth and the Diamonds as defending fascism, or being too tepid and cowardly toward political violence. And to an extent, I understand how an adult can come to these critiques, but those people are focusing on the wrong details and then extrapolating those details to something a child in no way has the ability to draw a conclusion from. Bismuth was a friend of Rose, a friend of Steven's family, and she has a tendency to be brash and resort to violence before trying to understand people, placing Steven as the victim of this, as Steven is trying to get Bismuth to understand, and Bismuth refusing to listen or insisting he's lying instills in children times when the shoe may have been on the other foot, where they may have jumped to conclusions, not asked questions, and later found out they were wrong and have hurt somebody in the process. That because they were unwilling to listen and consider that they might be missing something in the bigger picture, they hurt someone in the process. teaching children that they should prioritize getting the full picture without jumping to conclusions is an amazingly effective lesson to tell children. It's something that shows them how them doing that could really hurt people who don't deserve it. Because again, Bismuth isn't evil here. She joins the gyms and everything is fine eventually. Her reason for trying to kill Steven is purely a lack of understanding and a lack of trust. Steven and her disagree, sure, but people forget that the reason Bismuth is bubbled is because Bismuth jumps to the conclusion that Steven must secretly be Rose, instead of taking time to understand and hear Steven out. This is how a child is going to watch the show and then latch this concept onto their personal life experiences. An 8-year-old isn't going to be like, yes, this episode is about telling the black civil rights leader Malcolm X that violence is always unacceptable. Are you stupid? This is why it's important to not dismiss the demographic a show is being made for, and why a show tailored to kids may take on different meanings when observed in a non-kid-centered context. From a viewer that throws in things a child would almost certainly have no means to understand or know. This is like if you saw an episode on how you should always share because sharing is caring, and then got mad at it saying, you shouldn't always share. What? You want children to share their bodies with predators? This show is pro-child abuse. You'd be laughed out of the room for proposing this interpretation, if not uncomfortably kicked out. But logically, the person who would say that is technically putting things together. Yes, you shouldn't always share, but in the context of a kid who doesn't want to give their friend a toy, it's harmless. A positive social skill, actually. Context is critical for understanding the intent of a work, and that's why it's always important to keep in context how Steven Universe being a kid's show affects the way that its lessons are meant to be interpreted. Let's look at the diamonds. To ask what way the show is imparting the diamonds characterization to the audience, we can start with what the show does explicitly, repeatedly. A complaint often levied is that Steven realizes the diamonds are family and everybody is happy, the end, but it's important to characterize how a child would connect to the diamonds in their real life. Being someone between the ages of 8 to 12, you are substantially shorter, smaller, weaker, and not as experienced as most of your relatives. You have little to no power in the relationship between you, but while adults in your life could be senselessly cruel, there's always a possibility that they simply misunderstand you. There's a lot of trans allegory with Steven's return and the diamonds having trouble calling him Steven instead of Pink. There's a lot of confusion over the form that Steven has taken, thinking it's a fake, offensive appearance that Pink has put on, and only after separating the gem from the person do the diamonds see that the true person deep down is Steven and not Pink. Again, this allegory does not logically correlate entirely, but for those that it would resonate with, it does. Using abstraction, they are able to tell a story of coming to terms with and understanding queerness, and also navigating those things with a family who doesn't already understand, or maybe even accept them, especially when it comes to misconceptions or lack of experience. This is led up to earlier in a thematic sense, with Uncle Andy, a distinct relative that takes issue with Lapis and Peridot, in this case being coded as a lesbian couple and a homophobic relative. Steven can't just kill his uncle, or take the barn from him. So, through persistence, earnestness, and understanding, Steven is able to play on his uncle's love of him as a relative enough to have him soften his heart, change his mind, and put some of his biases aside. Think of this like a family coming together for Christmas or Thanksgiving. Maybe there's one homophobic or racist family member, or maybe a few, and maybe people are just insensitive or don't care. You are a child, with little to no choice in being present there, and being related to them having limited number of solutions that you can bring about. You could stay quiet, sure, but you could also appeal to your innocence and good nature, the inherent way that people look at children, in if not getting them to change their mind, at least getting them to quiet down with the cruel language that they espouse publicly. Imagine someone says, "I hate so-and-so race of people," and the kid kindly responds, "I have a friend who is of that race, and they are really nice." Is this hypothetical family member going to say, "No, 8-year-old child, you're wrong in being tricked. This child is secretly evil"? Most of the time I'd bargain to say no, unless your whole family is unabashedly evil, but the mere optics of a response like that in a normal context would be unpalatable to most people. The thing is, though, that's distant family. short encounters, small events spent together. The diamonds are sort of like unavoidable family. A threat that a child can't escape so easily. So you see how kill the diamonds is a stupid solution for a children's show? Might as well say, does your dad not let you do what you want? Does he tell you to go to bed? Go to the kitchen and grab a knife. This will solve things. We have to be considerate of what the show is explicitly saying as much, if not more, than the things that we could imply with our own adult perspectives. We have to view things as a child would to determine if something aimed at children is being toxic. A reasonable thought from here, I think, would be, okay, so why does Steven Universe cover such dark issues like war, freedom, and life-ending threats? And I have to say, this is all about framing. I could say Steven Universe is about magic space rocks teaching each other how to be nice, and framing it that way would be equally valid as the first way. Okay, but let's engage more directly. Specifically, fascism is inherently anti-human. It stems from a denial of knowledge and growth, the abuse of power and unwillingness to accept the innate parts of the human being. It denies the existence of things that don't fold into a preconceived way of living, a narrative. The conflict between the gems in Steven Universe is the people who say that we should all fall in line, live how society tells us, and not question anything. Those people are represented by Homeworld. Then we have all of humanity, and the Crystal Gems, represented by the ultimate potential of change, led by Pink, who again represents such the joy of varied, personally picked lives and personal happiness. This is something that lends itself especially well to queer themes of struggle, but also helps any kid who feels insecure for one reason or another. The thing is, though, as abstract and philosophical as this concept seems, it perpetuates itself on every stage and level of life, and if you try to accurately represent the first group's values, you always replicate fascism. It's a push and pull that has been fought for throughout all of human society. Those who wish to grow, understand, and change, and those who wish to conserve the past and remain in the cave. Those who prioritize freedom and exploration, and those who prioritize order and safety. This, as a broader theme, perfectly embodies the struggle on a human level, a level for queer reading, and an interpersonal story both in regards to individual episodes about the characters and the overarching plot beats. Also, we've been allowing little boys to own military toys and fake made-up wars for decades, and none of the people complaining about Steven Universe have thrown a fuss and made multi-hour videos about that. Why is the colorful show about magic rock people suddenly the line where we draw on not depicting any type of war to kids, even fantasy space ones? I mean, we never even see any of the real fighting, only silhouettes and allusions to it. It's bigotry disguising itself as puritanism. Now, maybe the show is idealistic, but an ideal is still a thing worth striving for, is it not? An ideal forms the basis from which we all set our sights, and the only place an ideal world can be recognized is in art. This is almost certainly the reasoning done by the charming positivity of the series, and I think that's validated by the second to last episode of Season 1, Open Book, where we get two perspectives on the ending of a book series that Steven and Connie like, with Connie hating the ending and Steven being too afraid to tell her that he liked it. Connie says, "I thought the ending was a disaster. All of the books leading up seemed to be taking on and subverting these witch tropes it was really aware of being a pastiche, you know? But in the end, none of that even mattered. Lisa and her falcon, rebels, challenging the traditions of the magical bureaucracy. I love that. Then her falcon turns into a human and they get married? It completely dropped all the anti-authoritarian stuff and described a wedding cake for 50 pages. She continues, I bet since the books got so popular, the publisher put pressure on the author to water down the end for the larger audience appeal. Unlike art, the real world can't always win against the iron chains of authority. Other than being a very funny, in-character way of presenting this idea, the whole episode is about Steven getting the confidence to be honest with Connie and tell her the truth about how he feels. He ends with, I thought it was sweet that Lisa and Archimicarus got together in the end. They were always so thoughtful towards each other, and I was so happy when he found the spell to make them human, and I loved every page about that cake. I wanted to draw a picture of it. Do you think I'm a worse person for liking the ending? Connie replies, "Of course not, Stephen. It's just a book. I care about you more." "Oh, of course you liked the wedding. You're Stephen. You love schmaltz." Then they conclude by going into specifics of their different interpretations and why they got the conclusions that they did. Honestly, it's both hilariously ironic and embarrassing that to this day, Stephen and Connie as fictional 13-year-olds handled the discussion far more maturely than the internet ever did over Steven Universe the show. I don't know how someone could watch this episode at the end of Season 1 and then not be self-aware when making a critique of the show, or even worse, completely avoid mentioning this episode at all. Like, at least address it or something. It's basically the creators screaming at you what they had planned for Steven Universe. That while the show covers grander, important concepts, there's still a lot of value in letting kids know it's going to be okay, at least in art, to give them the strength to believe in that happy ending and keep trying. Steven's overwhelming optimism and Connie's cynicism play off of each other in a really self-aware way here that is clearly commenting on the meta of producing a large-scale project for a major publisher or network. Rebecca fought for years behind the scenes to get countless queer rep passed, her crowning achievement being the wedding at the end. She even made sure to connect it to a major plot beat so that other countries would have a harder time enforcing and editing around the gay aspects. Putting Ruby in a dress suddenly created a problem for all sorts of homophobic regions who cast Ruby's dub voice actor as a male, and it really did push against things more so than any other show for its time or before. It's telling that the ending of Steven Universe, more or less, gave a mix of what Connie and Steven both wanted. They still got the wedding and the anti-authority bits. They got the happy ending. Steven, as a kid, simply says that he liked the wedding, that he was just happy to see everyone get along. Why do we have to act like kids being allowed to dream of a happy ending is a moral failing? Like presenting kids with an unrealistically happy story is somehow sinister? Why do we have to dismiss the perspective and impact of children watching the show in favor of our more cynical adult sensibilities? It's not just a kid's show, but it is a kid's show. We shouldn't take glee in ruining their fun and dragging them into the real world so soon, and there's nothing wrong with letting a kid dream. Especially if they're marginalized in some day and are already experiencing horrible things in their personal life. Having a comfort show to go back to, a comfort story, character, a good ending to escape to when times are rough, and good lessons on how to handle these similar things they may be experiencing in their real life but not always getting the happy ending for. Kids need this stuff. And yeah, Steven Universe won't fix their problems, but one step in the right direction is better than standing still or walking the opposite way. This video is just the prelude to my season-by-season analysis of Steven Universe, trying to give some starting context and thematic analysis that I think will help frame the show going forward and how I address it. I'm going to mostly be talking about character arcs and whatnot going forward. If the other parts of this series aren't out yet, you can check out my responses to the 3 most major, in my opinion, Steven Universe videos that I think negatively impacted the discourse. And if you've already seen them, I implore you to become a patron or buy me a coffee and be included in my upcoming videos. The first of the Steven Universe videos I made got limited ads, and this is my primary job and income, so it seriously helps. You can also ask me a question on Patreon, and I might answer it at the end of an upcoming video. Thank you so much, and please take care of each other. Another reminder to scan my QR code and get special bonuses from Raid Shadow Legends. I don't need you to respect me, I respect me. And I don't need you to love me, I love me. I just want you to know you could know me if you change your mind. If you change your mind.